When my brother slid the transfer documents across the boardroom table and told me to sign them over, I set down my pen, looked him straight in the eye, and said no. That was when he stood up, leaned across the table, and told me I had 24 hours to change my mind or he would make sure I had nothing left. The entire room went silent. My aunt was there. My uncle was there. Three of my grandfather's oldest business partners were there. And not one of them said a word. I should back up. My grandfather, Alistair, built his company from nothing. He started it out of a garage in Sudbury in 1971, a small electrical contracting firm that eventually grew into one of the largest commercial construction outfits in Northern Ontario. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did for a living, he had hundreds of employees and contracts across the province. He was not a flashy man. He drove a sensible truck, wore the same brand of work boots for 30 years, and believed that if you wanted something to last, you built it carefully and you built it right. He also believed in me in a way that, honestly, I didn't always feel I deserved. I was 22 when I moved back to Sudbury after finishing my business degree at Queen's. I had a vague plan that involved working for a few years, maybe moving to Toronto eventually, doing something corporate and anonymous. My grandfather called me the week after I graduated and asked me to come work with him instead. Not for him, with him. That distinction mattered to him. So I did. For the next 7 years, I worked my way through every department of that company: estimating, project management, accounts receivable, procurement. My grandfather insisted on it. He said the only person who could ever truly run a business was someone who understood every part of it from the inside. I earned my project management professional designation on my own time. I completed a CPA program while managing two major government contracts simultaneously. I was not handed anything. I worked for every piece of ground I stood on. My brother Donovan was 12 years older than me. He had worked at the company too, technically. He held the title of VP of Business Development, which in practice meant he took clients out for dinner, played a lot of golf, and occasionally signed off on proposals that other people had written. He was charming in the way that people sometimes are when they have never had to actually deliver on what they promise. Clients liked him. My grandfather tolerated him. I think my grandfather loved him the way you love someone you have largely given up trying to change. Donovan had a wife, Camille, who was even more ambitious than he was and significantly less subtle about it. She came from money herself, which somehow made her want more of it. They lived in a house in Oakville that cost more than I will probably earn in the next decade, and they spent accordingly. My grandfather got sick in the spring 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that does not give you a lot of time to argue. He was diagnosed in April and gone by November. In the months between, he was very clear about what he wanted. He told me, quietly, during one of the evenings I spent sitting with him at his kitchen table, that he was leaving me the controlling interest in the company, 53%. He said Donovan would receive the remaining shares and a generous financial settlement and that he hoped his son would use it wisely. He said this without bitterness. He just said it plainly, the way he said most things. I asked him if he was sure. He said he had never been more sure of anything in his professional life. He passed away on a Tuesday morning in November with me and my aunt at his bedside. The will was read 2 weeks later in the offices of his solicitor, a methodical man named Mr. Hargreave, who had handled my grandfather's affairs for over 20 years. It was exactly what my grandfather had told me: 53% controlling interest to me, the remainder of the shares, and a cash settlement of $400,000 to Donovan. The family home in Sudbury went to my aunt, who had cared for my grandfather in his final months. Various other bequests to longtime employees, and a local trade scholarship my grandfather had funded for years. Donovan did not react during the reading. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and he did not look at me once. Camille was not in the room. Spouses had not been invited, but I knew she was waiting in the lobby. I could feel it. I thought the worst was over. I was very wrong. The first call came 3 days after the will reading. Donovan, on speakerphone, with Camille clearly audible in the background, telling me that he intended to contest the will on the grounds that our grandfather had not been of sound mind. I listened to the whole thing. I said I understood and that he was entitled to pursue whatever legal avenue he felt was appropriate. Then I hung up and sat at my grandfather's desk, my desk now, and stared at the wall for a very long time. Over the following weeks, the pressure escalated in ways I had not anticipated. Donovan began calling my grandfather's oldest business partners, the men who had known Alistair for decades, and telling them privately that I was inexperienced, that I had manipulated a dying old man, that the company was not safe in my hands. One of those partners, a man named Mr. Doan Okafor, who had known my grandfather since the 80s, called me directly to tell me what Donovan was doing. He said he did not believe a word of it, but he thought I should know. Then Donovan's lawyer sent a letter to the company's bank suggesting that the change in controlling ownership was under legal dispute and requesting that certain accounts be flagged pending resolution. It was a pressure tactic designed to make our banking relationships uncomfortable, to make me feel like the ground was shifting under me. I want to be honest about something. There were days during that period when I came very close to calling Donovan and asking him what it would take to make it stop. I was tired. I was grieving. I was trying to run a company that employed 400 people while simultaneously being attacked on every front by my own family. I thought about what my grandfather would say, and I kept coming back to the same thing. He chose me because he trusted me to hold the line. He had seen something in me that he did not see in his own son, and however uncomfortable that truth was, he had acted on it. I was not going to undo that. So instead of calling Donovan, I called a lawyer of my own. Her name was Miss Wentworth, and she was exactly the kind of person you want on your side when everything is on fire. She was calm and precise, and she did not waste words. Within 2 weeks of retaining her, she had filed responses to every legal action Donovan had initiated, documented the timeline of my grandfather's mental competency with statements from his physicians and from Mr. Bitchrenant, Hargreave, and sent a very politely worded letter to our bank clarifying that the ownership transfer was legally sound and the dispute frivolous. But there was something else I did quietly, on my own, in the evenings. I had been living inside the financial records of that company for 7 years. I knew those numbers the way you know a house you grew up in. Every corner, every creak in the floor. And when I started going back through the accounts from the years when Donovan had nominally been in charge of business development, I found things that did not add up. It started small. Expense reports for client entertainment that seemed inflated. A vendor account I did not recognize. A consulting retainer paid quarterly to a numbered company that I could not identify in any of our project files. I kept going. I pulled records going back 4 years. I spent 3 weekends at my kitchen table in Sudbury with printed spreadsheets and a highlighter and a notepad, the way my grandfather used to work when he was trying to understand something. By the end of the third weekend, I had a very clear picture. Donovan had been billing the company for fictitious client expenses and redirecting the payments to accounts he controlled. The consulting retainer was paid to a numbered company registered in his wife's name. It was not enormously sophisticated. It was the kind of thing that works precisely because no one is watching carefully, because the person doing it holds a senior title and everyone assumes the paperwork is in order. Over 4 years, the total came to just over $230,000. I did not confront him. I did not tell him I knew. I took everything to Ms. Wentworth, who brought in a forensic accountant, a composed woman named Miss Countin, Beaumont, who went through every file I had and confirmed my findings with the kind of clinical thoroughness that made me deeply grateful I had found her. Then Ms. Wentworth filed a formal report with the appropriate authorities, and we waited. The board meeting was scheduled for the third week of January. It was the first full board meeting since my grandfather's death, and it was meant to formally ratify my position as majority shareholder and acting CEO. Donovan had been CC'd on the notice, as was required. He showed up with his own lawyer and a manila folder, visibly confident, and he announced at the top of the meeting that he would be presenting documentation that he believed invalidated the share transfer. I let him present it. He had obtained a letter, and to this day I do not know exactly how, purporting to be from a physician, suggesting that my grandfather had exhibited signs of cognitive decline in the months before his death. It was a weak document. Mr. Hargreave, who was present, said so directly and without any particular emotion. He noted that he had met with my grandfather no fewer than 6 times in the final months of his life to discuss the will and the succession plan, and that Alistair had been sharper than most people he had dealt with at any age. But Donovan pushed forward. He said the company was being put at risk by someone with no real leadership experience. He said decisions I had made in the months since my grandfather's passing had endangered existing contracts. He looked around the room at those senior partners, those men who had built careers alongside my grandfather, and he made his case with the fluency of a man who has spent his career convincing people of things he does not quite believe himself. The room was quiet when he finished. I waited until the quiet had fully settled. Then I opened the folder in front of me. I had printed the summary document that Ms. Beaumont had prepared, 62 pages, clean and factual, cross-referenced with bank statements and vendor registrations and expense records going back 4 years. I slid a copy to every person at the table. I did not raise my voice. I explained what I had found. I explained the numbered company. I explained the consulting retainer. I explained that a formal report had already been filed and that an investigation was underway. I watched Donovan's face while I spoke. I watched the moment it changed. His lawyer put a hand on his arm at some point. I did not stop talking. When I finished, I set down the document and I said one more thing. I said that my grandfather had built this company over 50 years through honest work, and that every person in that room had at some point trusted him with their business, their reputation, and in some cases, their friendship. I said I intended to honor that. I said the only question was whether the people in that room were going to honor it too. Mr. Okafor was the first to speak. He said very quietly that he had known Alistair for over 30 years and that Alistair had been an excellent judge of character. He said he had no further questions about the share transfer. One by one, the others followed. Donovan left before the meeting formally concluded. His lawyer stayed long enough to collect the copies of Ms. Beaumont's report, which I thought was probably wise of him. In the weeks that followed, the investigation moved forward. I will not say it was easy to watch. Donovan was my brother. Camille called me exactly once. A phone call I will not describe in detail, except to say that it was long and that very few of the things she said were true, and that I let her finish before I told her, calmly, that I had nothing further to add and that she should direct any future communications to Ms. Wentworth. Then I hung up. I sat in my grandfather's kitchen with a cup of tea and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened before I put it down and moved forward. The charges that followed were serious. Fraud over $5,000 carries real consequences in Canada, and the forensic evidence was substantial. Donovan eventually reached a settlement that involved full repayment, plus penalties and a criminal record that will follow him in ways that are not my problem to manage. The $400,000 inheritance he had received from my grandfather was applied almost entirely to the repayment. There is a version of this story where I feel sorry for him. I have tried to locate that version. What I find instead, when I am honest with myself, is something simpler. I feel sorry for my grandfather, who worked for 50 years to build something real and deserved better from his son. I feel grateful that I was the one sitting at that table in January. I feel grateful that I had learned to read a balance sheet the way my grandfather taught me, carefully, without assumptions, and all the way to the end. The company is doing well. We completed 3 major municipal infrastructure contracts in Ontario last year, and we have 2 more in the pipeline. I hired 2 project managers in the spring, both of them women in their early 30s, both of them sharper than I was at their age. I think my grandfather would have approved. I keep a photograph of him on my desk. It is from sometime in the 80s before I was born. He is standing outside the original office in Sudbury in his work boots, squinting into the sun, looking exactly like a man who knows what he is building and intends to see it finished. I think about what he told me the last time we sat together at his kitchen table, the week before he died. He said he had made a lot of mistakes in his life, and that most of them he had made by trusting the wrong people. He said I was not one of his mistakes. I intend to spend the rest of my career making sure he was right. I still think about that photograph on my desk sometimes. My grandfather standing outside his original office in Sudbury, squinting into the sun in his work boots, looking like a man who already knows exactly how the story ends. He built something real. And when it was threatened, the only thing that saved it was the fact that he had spent years quietly teaching me how to see clearly. What I understand now, looking back on everything that happened with my brother, is that nothing in that boardroom was actually a surprise. It was the result of choices made over a long period of time by people who believed they would never be held accountable. Donovan had been skimming from the company for 4 years because no one was watching carefully enough. Camille had encouraged it because she had confused ambition with entitlement for so long that the line between them had disappeared entirely. And I had spent 7 years learning every corner of that business. Not because I was planning for a confrontation, but because my grandfather believed that honest work, real, thorough, unglamorous work, was the only foundation worth standing on. That is the thing I keep coming back to. The people who tried to take what wasn't theirs didn't lose because I was lucky, or because the timing worked out, or because someone intervened on my behalf. They lost because I had done the work. I knew those spreadsheets. I could read a vendor account the way other people read a text message. That knowledge was not an accident. It was the accumulated result of years of showing up and paying attention. And when the moment came, it was simply there. I think sometimes about what I would have done if I had confronted Donovan the moment I suspected something, in those early weeks after the will reading. If I had picked up the phone and made it emotional and messy and personal, I think about how differently it would have ended. Instead, I waited. I gathered everything. I brought in people who knew more than I did. I let the evidence speak in a room full of witnesses who had known my grandfather for 30 years. There is a version of strength that looks like aggression, and there is a version that looks like patience and preparation. And I know now which one actually holds. What it took to get through that year, the calls, the legal letters, the nights at my kitchen table with a highlighter and a stack of printed spreadsheets, was not something I could have summoned on short notice. It came from somewhere I had been building for a long time without fully realizing it. The integrity to refuse to sign something I knew was wrong. The clarity to understand what was actually happening instead of what I was being told was happening. And the endurance to keep going on the days when I was exhausted and grieving and genuinely unsure whether I had enough left. My grandfather used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when things were easy. It was what they did when everything was being taken from them and they still had a choice about how to respond. I think I finally understand what he meant.